All right, guys. So today we're talking about DC statehood as Congress is currently debating this issue. And it is expected that the Democrats are going to pass a bill that will allow DC statehood, thus granting that district that is overwhelmingly Democrat 2 more seats in the Senate. And the Republicans are calling this a power grab. They're saying not only is this unconstitutional, but it is also a overt power grab by the Democrats. Okay, so the arguments right now are currently going on in Washington, D.C., and it is expected to pass the House. However, obviously, without repealing the filibuster or getting rid of the filibuster, it's not going to go anywhere in the Senate. But I do think this is a conversation worth having because, guys, this is really a complicated issue. I personally think there are strong arguments on both sides, and there is no real easy solution here, right? So let's go back to the actual Constitution in regards to what the purpose of having an independent federal district is, okay? It was, right, at the time in which it was formed, because this forms the basic argument from the Republicans in regards to why Washington, D.C. should remain independent. So, in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, it says, "The Congress shall have power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 square miles as may by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of the government of the United States." Now, again, this section right here, the Constitution, guys, essentially gives the federal government control over the district, right? The federal government basically controls everything in regards to the city budget, operations, things of that nature. Now, this stuff has changed over time, guys, as originally the land of DC was given to the federal government by Virginia and Maryland. Now, Virginia took back some of that land, right? So now today's land that is currently Washington, D.C. is land that was given to the federal government by Maryland. And also over time, we know that the original intent was for Congress to control most of the operations and the budgets and things of that nature that happens in the district. However, what has happened is that Congress has kind of given up a lot of that authority and power to local legislators, right? Like, for example, they have a mayor, they have a city council, elected representatives that do kind of carry out those operations with the Congress's ability to override any of that stuff. But as you kind of see over time, it's kind of become more of a district that kind of has its own set of legislators that are, kind of controlling the city operations, with Congress not always necessarily being directly involved in what goes on, right? And also over time, DC has been given electoral votes in the presidential elections. However, they still don't necessarily have representation in Congress. And that is one of the strongest Democratic arguments, as the license plate in DC is taxation without representation. Okay. And the Democratic argument kind of goes like this, right? How is it fair that, a district that now has over 700,000 people are being taxed, in which, they're paying the highest taxes per capita, and they don't even have representation over what goes on with the federal government outside of obviously voting for the president, but they don't get any representation in Congress. Okay. And in my opinion, that is a pretty strong argument. However, I will say that at the time in which, the Constitution was written, I do believe that the founders probably did not think that the District of Columbia would become this big. Okay, they probably not intended to have this many inhabitants and for the federal government to grow to this size, in which it essentially would be larger than 2 states that we already have right now, which is Wyoming and Vermont, right? But what the founders were thinking about is obviously the impact of having the federal government be under the control of a state, and how a state power, a partisan power, could potentially have outright influence and control over the federal government. In fact, in Federalist number 43, James Madison explained the need for a federal district subject to Congress's exclusive jurisdiction and separate from the territory and authority of a single state. Quote, the indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. It is a power exercised by every legislator of the Union. I might say of the world by virtue of its general supremacy. Without it, not only the public authority might be insulted and its proceedings be interrupted with impunity, but a dependence of the members of the general government on the state comprehending the seat of the government for protection in the exercise of their duty might bring on the national councils an imputation of awe or influence equally dishonorable to the government and dissatisfactory to the other members of the Confederacy. Now, James Madison, his concerns about public authority were not unfounded, because back in 1783, and when the capital was still in Philadelphia, it was overrun, and the congressional session was interrupted by unpaid and angry members of the Continental Army, in which the state of Pennsylvania failed to protect the members of Congress and the federal government at the time. Okay, so this kind of goes as direct evidence in regards to the constitutional argument of why the federal government needs to have an independent district in which they control themselves without necessarily being a state, right? It gives the federal government the ability to protect itself if it comes under attack without having to rely on a state. And it also prevents states from exercising control of the federal government, right? Partisan states, right? So for example, if DC was a part of Maryland, right, then theoretically the legislator or the government of Maryland could try to exercise control of the federal government, giving that state outright control over the country as a whole, right? So those are kind of the arguments in regards to why it needs to be an independent district. Now, the Democrats, outside of the taxation without representation argument, are using a whole bunch of other arguments that really are irrelevant in my opinion, right? The first of which is the race argument, right? They want to say, well, overwhelming majority of the district is black, right? And this is a race issue. This is a social justice issue. And in my opinion, the Democrats always use these arguments when they don't really have an argument, right? Because the legislation that they would propose obviously will require a constitutional amendment, which required an amendment either to get rid of the district as a whole, right, which means there's no federal district, or what they would have to do is that they would have to basically just make the district just the 3 houses of Congress, which is their current proposal, and make everything else around it a state in and of itself in order to stay constitutional. But at the same time, the 23rd Amendment would technically give just those 3 houses of Congress and whoever resides in that area, right, that 2 mile area, 3 electoral votes in the election, right? And obviously people think that would be silly as well. So there's an argument to be made that, the Democrat proposal would require, substantial changes to the Constitution in order to fit. So in terms of what do I think about this? Do I agree with the Democrats or do I agree with Republicans? I actually agree with both, but I lean more towards the Republican argument. I think it's better to keep it the way it is, even though I think it's unfair that the citizens there are paying taxes and not getting representation. And I would be more sympathetic to this if the Democrats were actually making those arguments on principle, but they're not, right? They're not trying to actually solve the problem of taxation without representation without getting that obvious power grab that comes with making DC a state. The power grab in which would give them 2 extra seats in the Senate, right? Which essentially would make it a lot harder for Republicans to ever get the majority again, which again is why Republicans are opposed to it, on top of the whole Constitution thing, right? Now, if the Democrats was making arguments based on principle, right, they would basically, be trying to make proposals where maybe some of the land outside of, the congressional buildings just goes back to Maryland. And that's a process called retrosection, in which the land would go back to Maryland and those people would technically be Marylanders. Okay. And that to me would solve that issue. Now, that would come with its own set of problems, but at the same time, that is a proposal, in my opinion, that would be more realistic. And that's what the Democrats would be pushing for if they actually were doing this on the principles of, well, we want to give these people representation in Congress. But that's not why they're doing it. They don't care about the people and whether or not they get representation. What they really care about is the fact that they know that these are two automatic Democratic seats, right? And because of that, I think the Republicans are right in the sense that this is just a power grab from the Democrats. Their intentions are not principle. Their intentions are to grab power. And that's why they're trying to use the argument of race rather than just focusing on the aspect of taxation without representation, which can be fixed, or, we can work around that without necessarily adding more power to the government for the Democrats. But see, again, the Democrats don't want to do that. Okay. And the reason why they want to do that, because it's all about power. Right. And that's, the obvious thing going on here. So in my opinion, I think that there has to be another solution that's worked out besides making DC a state and adding 2 more seats to the Senate, especially when you consider that, DC was never supposed to be a state in the first place. The district was always supposed to be under the control of the federal government, so the federal government could protect itself and can run operations without having influence from partisan states, right? And I think that is a strong argument, but I do think that these people that live in that district do deserve to be properly represented in Congress. I really do. I mean, they pay more taxes than 19 other states. They have the highest federal income tax per capita. It's definitely not fair for them to live there and pay taxes, but then don't have a say in terms of what happens in regards to congressional legislation. Right. That's very un-American, in my opinion. But I do think that there is a sweet spot here. And the sweet spot is an alternative to retrocession and statehood for the district that I think is constitutional and would protect the integrity of the federal district. And that would be to just treat the residents of DC as Marylanders just for the purpose of the congressional delegations. That way, they're represented at the Senate level. They're represented at the House level. However, for presidential elections, they still get their 3 electoral votes, right? So that doesn't, go against the 23rd Amendment. And there's not an overt power grab by the Democrats or really any party when it comes to, these elections and representation in Congress. Okay, I think that's the sweet spot that Democrats and Republicans should be able to agree on. But we all know, when it comes to Congress and coming up with common sense proposals, they don't want to do that, right? Everybody wants, to have their cake and eat it too. So, otherwise, I think retrocession would probably be the answer. But Maryland doesn't want that because they don't want the folks in DC to be involved in their politics. And probably the Republicans probably don't want that either because that means that Maryland would probably never be a Republican state again. Right. I think Maryland has a Republican governor, Larry Hogan, who Republicans really don't like right now. But that's besides the point. I'm just saying that the biggest weakness of retrocession would be that Maryland's local legislator would be influenced by DC. I think that they should just have the representation at the federal level for Maryland in terms of the congressional delegations. And they can just keep the 3 electoral votes for the presidential election. And I think that will make everybody happy for the most part, right? If it's about principle. That's what I think the solution should be. But obviously the Democrats probably don't want that, right? I don't think people in DC want that. I think they just want to be completely their own thing, their own state. So we will see how this works out. Obviously, it's not going to pass in this session of Congress, but I do think that this is an important thing to keep in mind, guys, in regards to the importance of the filibuster and also 2022, because it seems like the Democrats are doing everything they can to grab power from the Republicans moving forward into the future. So let me know what you guys think about this. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.